Hello everybody and welcome to Round Glass Review. And so this is really exciting for me. I really do want to do more of these on vintage lenses because they are, frankly, way more interesting to do. Anyway, the lens we're talking about today is the Nikon Nikkor 28mm f3.5. This lens was made by Nikon. The specific lens in this video was made between 1975 and 1977. Nikon made 28mm 3.5 lenses from 1960 until the mid-1980s, with an outlier of a much different design in the early 1950s. This model in this video was the last one produced in an AI interface, and it could be, like mine was, factory converted to AI. It was also, I believe, I think it was the last lens with this optical formula, although I don't have that in my outline for sure. So anyway, 28mm as a rule is a classic wide-angle lens good for landscapes, but at the time that this lens was released, I'm going to make the argument it would largely have been used in newsrooms by news teams taking snapshots that would have been cropped and printed in newspapers, probably with fast film at hyperfocal distance. And for that use, the slightly slower speed would have been fine, as this lens would have been used with that fast film. And resolution, of course, would not have been an issue because every film, even a vintage fast film, has a better resolution than newsprint. And being a less expensive lens, if it was damaged in the course of a newspaper photographer's day, it wasn't the end of the world to replace it. So let's get to the bluff, which is the bottom line up front. This lens provides staggeringly beautiful image rendering. Given that mirrorless cameras don't need or really benefit from fast lenses, which provide bright viewfinders and precise focus, which is something that SLRs did need, this is a fantastic lens that will pair beautifully on a modern mirrorless camera. Modern DSLRs with live view have the same advantage of not necessarily having to have very fast apertures as well. And given the price advantage of this lens, the 3.5, over faster 28mm lenses like the Nikon f2.8 or f2, or even competing makers' 28mm lenses, this lens should be on top of your to-buy list if you want a vintage 28mm lens. Offering you exactly nothing that isn't in many online and printed resources over the last 45 years, the focal length and AOV on this are 28mm and 75.4 degrees, respectively, for full frame or 35mm film cameras, and 42mm and 53.6 degrees for APS-C cameras. The aperture range is 3.5 through 22 and only in full stops. The filter size is 52mm, closest focus is 0.3 meters. It was available only in manual focus throughout the entire production run for this lens and spec. And as for the systems it was available in, it was in Nikon F-mount only. Originally, this lens and the ones before it were available in Nikon pre-AI or non-AI, AI being automatic indexing, and then later modifiable to an automatic indexing mount. So I used this lens on multiple Nikon film cameras, including the f4, f5, and f2. Probably should have put those in numerical order. Oh well, too late now. The Sony a7S II and the Sony a6400, the last of which being with both with and without a speed booster. I also used a macro focusing helical adapter with this lens on my a7S II sometimes, and here right now are a handful of samples from that with that adapter at the closest macro focus that this lens can achieve. So as a general note, this is true for this lens and all lenses, I'm going to make the argument. If you're adapting an SLR lens to a mirrorless camera, a macro adapter makes that an even more useful lens than it is straight out of the box. So with this lens and with every single SLR lens I will probably ever review in this series, if you're adapting it for a mirrorless camera, just pay the extra money for a macro adapter with infinity focus as well. and thank me later. The weight for the lens is 230 grams. Right up front, check out the series of identical shots taken at each aperture stop. What I want you to look for as these scroll across your screen is the vignetting, sure, because it's obvious. But more than that, look at the color cast of the images. Now, these were all shot in auto white balance in full sun, so full daylight spectrum light. Wide open, this lens renders warmly, but that dissipates as it stops down until by f8. This lens is very cool toned with a green cast that can turn warm tones kind of a sickly magenta if you use automatic color correction in post. Now, the color cast in your images can be corrected in RAW fairly easily. However, if you're shooting across lots of different apertures in fixed lighting during a single shoot, you will want to pay attention in bulk editing in RAW when you get back to your computer to ensure that you color correct the different images correctly. On full frame, this is a good street photography and landscape lens today. Those would be the best uses for it. On APS-C, it's a good general lens with a slightly wide normal focal length. This lens pairs well with mirrorless, but the relatively small aperture may trip up your focus peaking depending on your specific camera. And that's both with and without a speed booster. I found that magnifying the focus point by using manual focus zoom magnification with all of the cameras I used, the mirrorless cameras that I used it on, was mandatory when I was using the closer focuses. For APS-C users, a good speed booster will give you a lot from this lens, and I found that I really did like the way this lens performed with a speed booster, almost as much as I did without one. My only complaint with the speed booster was that my specific speed booster did introduce softness, distortion, and chroma into the very corners of all of the images, regardless of aperture. Also, as a small and light lens, this lens travels very well, especially if you're taking a film or digital SLR kit with you. One caution I would give you with this lens is not to use it for portraits because wide-angle lenses, writ large, as a rule, distort proportions a lot. It's noticeable with people because our brains are wired to seeing that. It's not so noticeable with landscapes and cityscapes and things like that because when we see those, we move our heads around and take it all in. And so the image replicates the way that our brains have us see those scenes. Now, if you do shoot APS-C with this lens without a speed booster, it could be used to take portraits. That's in the same way that a tugboat could be used for salmon trawling, but it will never really be this lens's wheelhouse. As for metering modes, a mode that uses the entire sensor or metering area will generally be best because with a wide angle like this, you will get a lot of sky and foreground in your landscape images especially, and you'll likely want your metering to include those. A specific time that isn't true. When you shoot from f3.5 to f5.6, the light loss around the image peripheries may or probably will affect your metering with full sensor metering modes, depending on how far out to the sensor periphery the meter in your specific camera reads. So when shooting at your wide apertures, if you use center weighted and embrace the vignette that the lens is going to give you, you will probably have results much more to your liking. One other note, this lens hails from a time when Nikon made high-end lenses exclusively made high-end lenses for professional photographers who demanded the best, without compromise, even for lenses with a slightly slower aperture like this one. And given that this lens design had already had decades of research and development in it before it was released, you would be right in expecting this lens to perform exceptionally in practical use. And it does. It does not perform exceptionally in things like technical testing and MTF readings, but then again, it was never meant to. This is a 6.6 retrofocus wide-angle lens. Now 6.6, which is 6 individual lens elements in 6 discrete optical groups, was a common retrofocus formula for 28mm f3.5 lenses in the late 60s through the 70s, and many makers used various 6.6 designs. There were a handful of outliers that were 7.6 or I think 8.9.8 or something like that for a couple of them, but very, very many of them were different takes on the 6.6 layout. It's well known, it's proven to work really well, and it's a reliable retrofocus design. And of course, as you likely know, all wide-angle lenses for SLR mounts are retrofocus in nature. They have to be because the mount length is longer than the focal length for the lens. Also, as a note, this is the same optical design as the early 1960s Nikkor H lens, but the version in this video has improved coatings versus the older Nikkor lenses. For this lens in this optical design, the version featured in this video is the Peak Evolution. Breathing is well controlled given this lens's age and its intent as a still lens with no design nor expectation from Nikon that it would be used for motion imagery. Focusing between objects that are not too far apart shows breathing that can be worked around relatively easily, especially considering that my examples here in this video are from very close focus where breathing is the most severe. Even focusing from nearest to furthest focus shows breathing that could generally be considered tolerable for amateur and student projects. The aperture is stepped with hard detents for full stops. If you elect to remove the detent ball on this lens's aperture, the lens will probably try to snap back to wide open every time you close it, which is an assumption I'm making based on the fact that my lens is much easier to adjust from small to larger apertures because it's trying to pull the aperture ring in that direction. A better stepless aperture workaround for you, if that's something that you need for this lens for your video project, is to get an adapter that allows the aperture to be opened and closed with a switch or preferably a ring on the adapter. One of my adapters has that, maybe two of them have that. And what I can do is set the aperture to the smallest setting that I want, basically using this lens like it's a preset lens. Then open the aperture all the way with the aperture control ring on the adapter, and then stop the aperture down slowly. I mean, like very slowly, because the ring that I used for this has functionally no throw, so it is a very delicate operation. However, that does provide a pretty good level of smooth aperture control. The front element on this lens is non-rotating, but it does move in and out around 1.5 centimeters. Focus throw is around 190 degrees, which gives you a significant and precise focus control, especially on the close end. The focus ring does move in and out, but only half as much as the front element, so motorized focus control should be relatively easy. These last three items are all your mileage might vary based on how old and well used your lens was prior to you buying it. I can only speak to my lens, so that's what I'm going to do here. Focus damping on my copy is non-existent. This lens, for me, is the second most well broken in lens I've ever used and has no resistance whatsoever in the focus. I would think that most of these, not having used a second one, would have damping that is in line with most vintage Nikon lenses, and I think mine is, I would hope, an outlier. Focus ring play is almost imperceptible on mine, but there's a very little bit. Now I would chalk that up to this lens's age and use for decades by a professional photographer before I bought it. Mount stability is, with mine, fairly well broken in with a little bit of mount play and shake on some of my adapters, which isn't uncommon, quite honestly. But there is no focus mount movement on my Nikon F cameras. For sharpness, I mean, really, it is stunning. This lens outperforms many, and I mean very many, of the lenses that I've bought new in the last 10 years. Now, I'm going to caveat that statement with very many of the lenses I've bought new in the last 10 years are inexpensive. The 28mm f3.5 Nikon does not outperform lenses like my Pentax Limiteds, my Irix, or my high-end Samyang wide-angle lenses. And that stands to reason because those were all designed with modern, very powerful computers, by the way. For build quality, it's good. Now, the specific lens I have, as I mentioned, was owned by a working and very active professional photographer who used it a lot, and it feels like it. The focus is a bit too smooth and a little bit too loose, and the aperture is a bit too broken in. Now, that said, it still works incredibly well despite the mileage, and I don't see it breaking or failing at any point in the future. And for still use, none of the broken inness, that's not an issue at all. It's only an issue for video. Contrast is very good, almost too strong sometimes. Now that said, contrast can be sapped by flare, which is true of all lenses. And I found that I never needed to add contrast to images from this lens, but that if you have the sun off in the periphery or outside of the frame, you can lose contrast in your shadows without getting a perceptible flare impression in your images. Aperture shape and blade count are 7 blades, and they create strongly heptagonal flare spots and 14-sided stars, and they also create heptagonally sided out-of-focus specular highlights, where you have a bright source point that's out of focus in the background. Out-of-focus area characteristics, because of that, the aperture shape and dynamic vary significantly by aperture. Wide open, I find them to be good with some coma around the image peripheries. Stop down, I find the out-of-focus areas to be a little bit jittery and distracting. If you plan to use this lens stop down, I would suggest that you plan to use it for deep depths of focus at or near your hyperfocal or zone focusing distances. Try to get as much of the background in focus as possible, or have as plain a background as possible if you're shooting up close. But a good way around that, a good way to get the most out of your out-of-focus areas when you're shooting up close, is to plan to use it wide open or maybe stop down as far as f5.6. For design flaws, by the standards of this lens's day, there were very few. As noted earlier, this lens was designed for demanding professionals who would lose money if an image were unusable due to significant design flaws like coma, flare, or astigmatism, and so forth. And vintage Nikon prime lenses are, almost by definition, excellent still today. As is the case with Nikon lenses of its era, design flaws are as highly controlled as possible given the technology of the time. Now, huge asterisk here, even though retrofocus designs had been in significant use for around a decade when this lens's original optical design was developed for the Nikkor H in the 1960s. That lens and this design were still early retrofocus designs. Now the coatings on this version of the lens are great, and I really did struggle to make this lens flare, and really had to have the sun in or just immediately adjacent to the frame to achieve flare. And at that, the flaring was pretty insignificant, especially by wide-angle lens standards. This lens does exhibit some field curvature, mustache distortion, and barrel distortion. A photography life review of this lens noted that the field curvature was enough to affect MTF performance. In practical application, none of those above-named flaws are significant enough to affect images, and you likely only notice them here in these photos I'm going to show right now of some graph paper that show the field curvature and barrel distortion, as well as horizontal and vertical images of the blinds at my apartment complex's clubhouse, which will show some mustache distortion in the sideways photo. Light loss is significant with this lens, but mostly becomes a non-issue past f5.6. And in many real-world settings, it's a non-issue by f5.6. As for your balance with cameras, this lens is a bit front light on heavy DSLRs, but with mirrorless cameras or light DSLRs like APS-Cs like the Nikon D3000 and 7000 and those ones, as well as film SLRs, it does pair really well. It's also light enough that with a speed booster on heavier APS-C mirrorless cameras, that the lens doesn't feel particularly front heavy. The most significant problem with modern lens designs is that some years ago, some very savvy marketing person said, hey, let's take all these engineering charts and throw them in our marketing literature. No one out there is going to know what they mean, but they'll assume that because those charts are included, they must mean this lens is awesome. Now, because of that, lens design suffers because so many new lenses are built to provide awesome MTF charts, not fantastic image characteristics. Why is that a problem? Because it makes the images from all of these modern lenses that are designed for technical perfection sterile, drab, and functionally lifeless, not to mention relatively identical across the brands. I can't tell you a modern Canon lens from a modern Sony, Nikon, or Fuji lens based on the image samples, with only a handful of exceptions. But I can pretty reliably recognize the image characteristic of vintage Nikon, Canon, Olympus, and Pentax lenses. And I think that losing a focus on image character, especially a unique image character to that maker, in the name of technical demonstration, has been a great loss to the camera industry. Part of using old lenses is embracing their image aesthetic and character. Lenses like this one were designed on ancient computers equally, perhaps less, powerful than a 4-function calculator. Humans with analog computing devices like slide rules still did a significant amount of manual design calculation on 60s and 70s lenses. These lenses are not close to as technically perfect as modern lenses, and that's a huge part of the magic. The imperfections in these lenses, and let's be clear that the imperfections are little more than nitpicky little differences in many cases, create photographs that capture scenes beautifully. Embrace it. That's what these lenses do, and do far better than many new lenses. In fact, the very same photography life review I read that pointed out this lens's field curvature and mustache distortion recommended the Nikon f/28mm f1.8G over this lens because it's sharper, and only a modicum sharper, across the whole field than this lens. But that article also downplayed, at best, that in the center, this lens is equally as sharp or sharper than that modern, faster lens. As a sidebar, I'm certain that the affiliate link in that article to the 28mm 1.8G had no bearing whatsoever on the lens recommendation. Quality high-end old lenses are not soft, and they are not poor, and they do not fill your images with flaws. Quality old lenses give your images a lifelike look and feel that is frankly unmatched by most lens makers today. This is an incredibly high-quality old lens, and if you know how to use it, your images will look fantastic. A lot of people come to this video series, and I believe they are looking for ways to improve their photography and their lens use, and I think there is this idea that a new lens will hold a secret magic that unlocks their photographic creativity. If that is you, here is the best advice you will ever hear about your photography. Ignore the technical reports and sections in lens reviews. Pick a lens based on what it does for your overall lineup. Base that on sample images you see from it online. If that lens has some kind of special magic that you need, it's not going to show it to you the first time out. So pick up a lens if you must, slap it on your camera, leave it there for 6 months, and use only it. Forget everything you know about lens technical data. Take the time to learn the vernacular of lens use from your lenses. Lenses will speak to you, but not on your clock and only if you try to listen.